I sat at a small round table in a real estate office in Playa del Carmen with a 6-page lease in front of me, entirely in Spanish, a language I could not read, speak, or meaningfully understand a single clause of, and I signed it anyway. Every page. Initialed the margins where the agent pointed. 35 years selling insurance for a living. A career built entirely on making sure people understood exactly what they were agreeing to before they signed anything, and there I was at 63 doing the single most unexamined signature of my entire life. I want to walk you through exactly how that happened, why I did it anyway, and what it actually taught me about trust. A subject I thought I'd mastered after 35 years of selling it to other people for a living. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real, occasionally embarrassing version of these stories every week. My name is Charles Bennett. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 35 years running my own independent insurance agency in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Auto and home policies mostly. A business built entirely on my ability to talk, explain, reassure, and close. A skill set that turns out, I'd later discover, to be almost entirely useless the moment the language underneath it disappears. I was good at it, genuinely good. The kind of salesman who could walk a nervous 22-year-old through a first car insurance policy, or talk a skeptical 70-year-old widow into finally updating coverage she'd been putting off for a decade. Purely through the specific combination of patience and plain talk I'd honed over 3.5 decades. I remember one client in particular, a stubborn rancher named Walt, who'd refused flood coverage for 15 years despite living near a creek that had jumped its banks twice in living memory. And it took me 3 separate visits, and by my own count, roughly 4 hours of careful, patient conversation before he finally signed. 2 years later, that same creek flooded his barn, and Walt called me personally. Not to complain, but just to say thank you. A phone call I still think about more than 2 decades later as the exact reason I loved that work. My wife, Karen, and I divorced 4 years ago. Amicably enough, both kids grown and gone by then, and I sold the agency the following year to a younger agent who'd worked under me for a decade, closing out 35 years of a career that had defined almost everything about how I moved through the world. I want to be honest about the year after selling that agency, because it wasn't the relaxed retirement I'd pictured. I'd spent 35 years being the guy in every room who knew exactly what to say, and suddenly I was a 62-year-old man with nowhere particular to be, and nobody particular expecting my calls. Tulsa felt smaller than it used to. Not physically, obviously, but in the specific way a city shrinks once your daily reason for moving through it disappears. I found myself most mornings that first year driving past my old agency's building out of pure habit, sometimes even parking across the street for a few minutes before catching myself and driving on. A grown man loitering outside a business that no longer needed him. My daughter Amanda out in Austin kept gently suggesting I find a hobby, and my son Tyler in Denver suggested golf, which I tried for exactly 6 weeks before admitting to both of them that hitting a small ball around a manicured lawn wasn't going to fill the specific hole that closing deals and talking to people all day had left behind. I even tried volunteering at a local senior center, teaching a basic financial literacy class, and while I enjoyed it well enough, it lacked the specific electricity of an actual close the moment a hesitant client finally says yes. Mexico came up almost by accident during a conversation with a former client, a retired school teacher named Bill, who'd insured his lake house through my agency for 20 years and had moved to Playa del Carmen 3 years earlier. He called me out of the blue one Tuesday just to catch up, and somewhere in that call, Hearing him describe mornings on the beach and a cost of living that made his modest teacher's pension stretch further than it ever had in Oklahoma, something in me sat up and paid attention in a way I hadn't in over a year. Bill mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd learned maybe 200 words of Spanish in his 3 years there and gotten along just fine, which struck me at the time as either genuine reassurance or the kind of thing a friend says to make a big decision sound smaller than it actually is. I flew down for a week that same spring, mostly to visit Bill, and came home having already started looking at apartment listings on my phone during the flight back. I want to be honest about the Spanish, because I think most retirement channels gloss over exactly how badly this went for me before it went right. I downloaded Duolingo the week I got back from that first trip, genuinely committed, doing my daily lessons every morning with coffee, the same disciplined way I used to review policy updates before opening the agency each day. I kept at it for 7 months, built up a streak I was genuinely proud of, 214 consecutive days according to the app's own count, and told myself repeatedly that consistency was the whole game. The same principle that had built my entire sales career. I can tell you with complete confidence that a green owl wanted me to know the word for the apple approximately 400 separate times, and somehow, despite that repetition, I retained almost nothing beyond hola, gracias, and a handful of phrases so basic they wouldn't get me through ordering breakfast unassisted. I tried a private tutor for 6 weeks toward the end of that stretch. A patient young woman who taught over video calls, and even she eventually admitted, gently, that my particular brain seemed to retain insurance policy structures and client names with total ease, while genuinely resisting new vocabulary in a way that frustrated us both. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, if any of you have had the exact same experience. Genuine effort producing genuinely disappointing results. Because I spent a long time assuming I was simply doing something wrong before I finally accepted that a 63-year-old brain, even a sharp one, doesn't absorb new language the way people expect it to from watching younger travelers online. I decided to move anyway, Spanish or no Spanish. A decision that genuinely alarmed both my kids when I told them. Amanda asked me, flatly, how I planned to sign a lease, open a bank account, or handle a medical emergency without being able to communicate, and I didn't have a great answer beyond telling her I'd figure it out. The same confidence I'd have projected to a nervous client 20 years earlier, minus the actual competence to back it up this time. Tyler, characteristically less direct than his sister, simply asked whether I'd thought it through, and when I admitted I hadn't entirely, he told me that was probably the most honest thing I'd said about the whole plan yet. A comment that stung a little precisely because it was accurate. The apartment hunt itself happened almost entirely over WhatsApp, which I quickly learned is how real estate actually functions in Mexico. Nobody uses email, nobody calls, everything moves through text messages and voice notes sent to a phone number listed under a grainy photo of an apartment. Bill connected me with a bilingual agent named Fernanda, who specialized in working with American and Canadian retirees. And our early exchanges were a genuinely comical mix of my broken phrases, her patient English, and both of us occasionally resorting to Google Translate mid-conversation when something got lost entirely. I remember one exchange where I meant to ask whether the apartment included air conditioning, and instead, according to Fernanda's gently amused correction the following message, asked whether the apartment included a small horse. She sent back a single laughing emoji in the actual answer, and somehow that exact small humiliation did more to relax me about the whole process than any Duolingo lesson had. Another time, trying to describe my budget range, I apparently told her I was willing to pay 15,000 pesos a week rather than a month. A mistake that generated a genuinely startled voice note asking if I'd meant to type what I typed. Before we sorted it out and both had a good laugh about it over the following call. I flew down for a proper scouting trip 5 months after that first visit with Bill. And Fernanda showed me 6 apartments over 4 days, walking me through each one in careful, patient English while I nodded along, asking the questions I could manage and trusting her translation for everything I couldn't. One building had a landlord who spoke 0 English at all, an older gentleman who nonetheless insisted on personally walking me through every room, gesturing at the water heater and the electrical panel with the specific pride of a man who'd built the place himself, and though I couldn't understand a single explanation, I found myself oddly moved by the effort itself. A stranger determined to communicate something important to me regardless of the barrier between us. I settled on a modest 1-bedroom about 8 blocks back from the beach, unfurnished, in a small building with maybe 12 units. The rent reasonable enough that I didn't need to negotiate hard, which was fortunate, since negotiating in a language I didn't speak wasn't a skill I'd developed yet. The lease signing itself is the moment I actually want to walk you through in detail, because it's the part that genuinely tested something in me I hadn't examined in decades. Mexican rental contracts typically require what's called a fiador, a local guarantor who owns property outright and agrees to cover your obligations if you default. A requirement that's nearly impossible for a brand new foreign arrival to satisfy, since you generally don't know anyone who fits that description yet, let alone anyone willing to take on legal liability for a stranger's rent. Fernanda explained through careful English and a fair amount of patient repetition that I had an alternative, a Pliza Hertica, essentially an insurance policy purchased through a specialized company that investigates your background and effectively guarantees the lease in place of a personal fiador for a one-time fee running somewhere between 30 and 50% of a single month's rent. The company running that background check called me twice over the following week, in English, verifying my income, my previous residence, even calling 2 references I'd provided back in Tulsa. An entire underwriting process I recognized instantly from the other side, having run something functionally identical for auto and home policies for 35 years myself. I want to note the specific irony there, because it wasn't lost on me even in the moment. 35 years selling insurance policies to nervous Americans who needed protection against exactly the kind of risk they couldn't fully evaluate themselves, and there I was, on the other side of that exact transaction for the first time in my adult life, purchasing a guarantee I genuinely couldn't read the fine print of. The actual signing happened in Fernanda's office, a 6-page contrato de arrendamiento entirely in formal, dense Spanish, covering the rent amount, the security deposit, maintenance responsibilities, an inventory list of every item and its condition, early termination penalties, renewal terms. All of it in language I could recognize maybe 1 word in 20 of. Fernanda walked me through the major points verbally, translating the substance of each section, pausing at each one to make sure I'd actually absorbed it, rather than just nodding along the way I noticed myself starting to do around page 3. She pointed out, specifically, the early termination clause, explaining that breaking the lease before 12 months would cost me the full security deposit plus an additional month's rent as penalty, a detail I made her repeat twice and actually write down in English on a separate notepad. The one piece of paper from that entire signing I could genuinely read myself. I sat there, a man who'd spent 35 years making absolutely certain his own clients understood every clause before they signed anything, doing the exact opposite for the first time in my life. Trusting a woman I'd known for exactly 9 days to have accurately represented terms I had no independent way of verifying. I also had to open a Mexican bank account that same week. A process I'd assumed would be simpler than the lease, and turned out, if anything, to be more disorienting. Sitting across from a bank officer who spoke almost no English, sliding documents back and forth while Fernanda, who generously agreed to accompany me for this errand too, translated in real time. I needed something called an RFC, a Mexican Tax Identification Number. Before the account could even be opened, another entirely Spanish language process that would have been genuinely impossible for me to navigate alone, involving its own separate government office, its own separate line, its own separate stack of forms I signed based entirely on Fernanda's summary rather than my own comprehension. By the time we finished that afternoon, I'd signed roughly a dozen documents across 2 separate institutions in a language I couldn't read, and I remember sitting in Fernanda's car afterward, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort, feeling like I'd just run a marathon made entirely of trust rather than distance. I asked Fernanda near the end of that signing whether she thought I was being reckless, and she gave me an answer that's stuck with me since. She told me, in her careful English, that every single American and Canadian client she'd ever helped had faced this exact moment. The specific vulnerability of signing something you can't read. And that the ones who handled it best weren't the ones who'd somehow mastered Spanish overnight, but the ones who'd simply decided to trust the right person and then actually done it. Fully, without constantly second-guessing the decision afterward. She told me a story of her own, briefly, about a semester she'd spent studying in Montreal years earlier. Signing a French language student housing contract she couldn't fully parse either, and how that specific memory was part of why she'd built her whole career around helping people through exactly this moment with as much patience as she could manage. I initialed the final page with a hand that was, I'll admit, not entirely steady. I think about that lease signing often, more than the actual apartment itself. Honestly, 35 years of my professional identity was built around being the person who understood things fully before committing to them. The person other people trusted precisely because he'd never asked them to sign something he couldn't explain completely. Sitting in Fernanda's office, initialing pages in a language I couldn't read, I had to become, for the first time in decades, the person on the other side of that exact transaction. And it turns out that particular vulnerability, the deliberate choice to trust someone else's word over your own understanding, taught me something about faith in other people that 35 years of being the trusted expert never once required me to learn. I spent 3.5 decades being trusted. I hadn't spent nearly enough time actually practicing the trusting myself, and there's a specific kind of humility in discovering that at 63, in a language you can't read, from a woman you'd known for barely over a week. Moving into that apartment 3 weeks later meant confronting the language gap daily in ways the lease signing had only previewed. My next-door neighbor, a widow in her late 70s named Doa Guadalupe, knocked on my door my second morning there holding a plate of tamales, speaking rapid, warm Spanish I understood perhaps every 5th word of. And I stood in my doorway doing the only thing available to me, smiling, nodding, saying gracias with as much genuine warmth as I could put into a single word, and accepting the plate with both hands. She came back the following week with a small hand-drawn map of the neighborhood, pharmacy circled, market circled, her own apartment number written large enough that even I couldn't misread it. An entire orientation to the neighborhood delivered without a single sentence I could translate on my own. That became, somewhat unexpectedly, the actual foundation of our relationship over the following months. An entire friendship built almost completely on gesture, tone, and the specific universal language of a woman deciding to feed her new neighbor, regardless of whether he could follow a single sentence she said. I've picked up meaningfully more Spanish in the 8 months since that signing than I managed in 7 months of Duolingo lessons back in Tulsa, and I think the difference is fairly simple. Necessity teaches faster than an app ever could, and Doa Guadalupe, along with the building's maintenance man, a patient young guy named Pedro, who's fixed my air conditioning twice now through a combination of broken English and my increasingly less broken Spanish, have taught me more actual usable language in 8 months of daily. Stumbling necessity than a green owl managed in over half a year of disciplined but ultimately hollow repetition. Pedro, in particular, has taken it upon himself to correct my pronunciation whenever I attempt a new phrase, the same patient, slightly amused correction Fernanda gave me over that small horse. And I've come to genuinely look forward to those corrections rather than dreading them the way I might have a year ago, back when getting something wrong still felt like a small personal failure rather than simply part of the process. Doa Guadalupe still brings tamales most Sundays, and I've started bringing her the specific brand of coffee she mentioned missing from a trip to Mexico City years ago. A small trade built entirely on attention rather than shared vocabulary. Bill asked me recently, over beers on his patio, whether I regretted signing that lease without understanding a word of it. And I told him the honest truth, that it was the single most nerve-wracking thing I'd done in years, and also, somehow, the thing that taught me the most about the specific kind of trust I'd spent 35 years selling to other people without ever fully practicing myself. Bill laughed and told me that in his experience, most Americans who move down here eventually face some version of that exact moment, whether it's a lease, a medical procedure, or a car repair. A moment where you simply have to hand your understanding over to someone else entirely and hope you chose well, and that the ones who thrive here are generally the ones who stop fighting that moment and start treating it as its own kind of education. My Spanish tutor back in Tulsa before I left once told me, gently, that I might simply be someone who learns better by doing than by studying. And I dismissed the comment at the time as a kind consolation for 7 months of disappointing progress. I think about that comment often now. Standing in my kitchen practicing a new phrase Pedro taught me that morning, or sitting on Doa Guadalupe's small balcony most Sundays, following maybe 60% of her conversation, and finding to my genuine surprise that 60% is often more than enough to build something real on. 35 years of talking for a living taught me how to make other people feel understood. 8 months of barely talking at all taught me something I badly needed and somehow never learned in all those years of selling, how it actually feels to be the one who has to trust rather than the one everyone else trusts. If you're sitting on a similar decision right now, wondering whether you need to master a language before you can build a life somewhere new, I gently suggest that Fernanda, Doa Guadalupe, and a very patient maintenance man named Pedro have taught me the opposite lesson entirely. I'm Charles Bennett. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.